The first winds came low and hollow across the plains, carrying with them a warning only a rancher's bones could understand. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his porch, watching the horizon fade beneath a veil of gray. The sky had turned the color of ash, heavy with snow yet to fall. He drew his coat tighter around his shoulders, not for warmth. His body had weathered far worse, but for the feeling of being braced against something bigger than himself. Winter storms in these parts did not ask permission. They simply arrived and claimed the land. The cabin behind him creaked in protest, its logs groaning against the bite of the wind. Ethan's gaze swept across the ranch, taking in the scattered outbuildings, the barn, the wooden fences now dusted with the first sprinkling of snow. He knew every post, every nail, every shadow. This land was all he had left, the only remnant of family that once filled these spaces with laughter, chores, and arguments over supper. Now it was just him, the land, and the silence. He moved methodically, as any seasoned rancher would before a storm. He pulled his gloves tighter, grabbed the axe leaning against the porch rail, and made his way to the woodpile. Each swing of the axe landed with sharp precision, splitting the logs in clean halves. The rhythm steadied him, a beat to drown out the loneliness pressing at the edges of his thoughts. He stacked the wood neatly, knowing he'd need more than usual. The storm smelled like one that planned to linger. By the time he returned to the barn, the wind had strengthened, rattling the doors and sending snow in through the cracks. Inside, the horses shifted uneasily, their ears twitching at the sounds of the storm. Ethan ran a calming hand over the flank of his gelding, Whisper, whose name was ironic for a beast that snorted like thunder. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured. "We've been through worse." He checked the stalls, tightened latches, laid extra hay. His animals came first, always had, always would. When the chores were done, he stepped back into the open air. Snowflakes now cut diagonally across the sky, tiny daggers driven by the wind. Ethan pulled his hat lower, tilting his head against the sting. A younger man might have cursed the weather, but Ethan only accepted it, the way he accepted everything else life had thrown at him. He had learned long ago that fighting the inevitable was wasted energy. Better to endure, to outlast. Back inside the cabin, he stripped off his gloves and coat, hanging them near the door. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and he stoked it with fresh logs, watching the flames leap to life. Heat spilled into the single-room space, illuminating shelves lined with tools, an old rifle, a handful of books too worn to read without squinting. It wasn't much, but it was home. He sat heavily in the chair by the fire, his bones weary from years of work that never seemed to end. The storm pressed harder against the cabin walls, howling as if it wanted to be let inside. Ethan leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment. Nights like these dragged on forever, long, cold, and filled with memories he'd rather forget. He saw his mother's face sometimes in the flames, heard his father's voice carrying the wind, remembered the way the house used to glow with life when Christmas came around. That was years ago, decades even. Now, holidays came and went like the storms, something to get through, nothing more. He rose again, restless, pacing the floor. The lantern light swayed with the draft, shadows stretching across the walls like ghosts. He pulled the old quilt tighter around his shoulders, though it was not the cold he was fighting. The truth was, silence had become both his companion and his curse. Out on the plains, no one asked about your past. No one judged you for keeping to yourself. But no one came knocking on the door, either. As the storm gathered strength outside, Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee gone bitter from hours on the stove. He cradled it in his hands, staring into the flames. Another storm, another night. That was how life went. Predictable, harsh, but familiar. He had long since given up expecting anything more. But as the wind screamed louder, rattling the very bones of the cabin, Ethan couldn't shake the strange feeling settling in his chest. Something was different about this storm. Something was coming with it. The storm raged long into the night, its howl seeping through the cabin walls like a living thing. Ethan Cole sat hunched forward in his chair by the fire, staring into the orange glow as the wind lashed snow against the windows. He was used to storms, used to nights where the world outside was a blur of white and nothingness. What he wasn't used to was noise that didn't belong to the storm. A dull thump echoed faintly from the barn. So soft at first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks. Then it came again. A knock. Steady, deliberate, impossible to mistake. Ethan froze, his instinct sharpened by years of solitude. Out here, in the dead of winter, no one came calling. The hair on the back of his neck rose as he pushed himself to his feet. For a heartbeat, he considered ignoring it. Whatever fool was out there had no business being on his land in the middle of a blizzard. But the knock came again, louder this time, almost desperate. Grabbing his coat and rifle, Ethan braced himself against the storm and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a hammer, wind and snow clawing at his face. Visibility was nearly gone. The world beyond the porch was swallowed in white. He trudged through the drifts toward the barn, his boots crunching with every step. The sound of knocking grew clearer as he neared, muffled against the thick wooden doors. With a grunt, he unlatched them and pushed inside. There, framed in the dim lantern light, he'd left hanging from a beam, stood a woman. Her cloak was dusted with snow, her face pale from the cold, and her gloved hands clutched the edge of the door as though she collapsed without it. Wide eyes, startlingly green, met his, and for a moment neither spoke. "Please," she said finally, her voice trembling as much from fear as from the chill. I need shelter. The stagecoach overturned a mile back. I've been walking since." Ethan's jaw tightened. He lowered his rifle, but didn't set it aside. A stranger, out here, in his barn. Every instinct told him this was trouble. Still, the storm behind her howled like a predator, and he knew she wouldn't survive long without warmth. "You'll freeze if you stay out there," he muttered gruffly. "Barn's dry enough. Horses won't mind the company." Her shoulders sagged in relief as she stepped inside, closing the door against the blizzard. Ethan lit another lantern and hung it higher, revealing more of her features. She was young, mid-20s maybe, and travel-worn. The hem of her skirt was soaked, her boots caked in snow. She carried no luggage, only a small satchel slung across her shoulder. She clutched it close, as if it were her only possession of value. "I'll manage here, thank you," she said softly, her teeth chattering. She glanced toward the horses in their stalls, then back at him with wary gratitude. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod. "Blankets are in that chest. Use what you need. I'll check the cabin." He turned to leave, telling himself she wasn't his concern. Strays weren't his responsibility. He'd done his part. But when he reached the porch again, he paused. The storm was worsening, snow piling higher by the minute. She wouldn't last in the barn, not in her condition. He cursed under his breath, then turned back, pushing through the door once more. She was already huddled on a blanket near the hay, her hands trembling as she tried to rub warmth back into her fingers. "Damn fool woman," Ethan muttered, though not loud enough for her to hear. Aloud, he said, "You'll freeze out here. Cabin's warmer." Her eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" "No," he answered honestly. "But come anyway." She rose unsteadily, gathering her satchel, and followed him across the short stretch of snow to the cabin. Inside, the fire's glow wrapped around them both, chasing the frost from their clothes and skin. Ethan hung her cloak by the fire while she stood uncertainly near the door, as though afraid to step farther in. "You can sit," he said, motioning to the chair opposite his. "Ain't fancy, but it's warm." She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair, sighing as the heat seeped into her bones. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," he said shortly. "Ethan Cole." "Sarah," she replied after a pause. "Sarah Bennett." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the storm outside. Ethan sat across from her, arms folded, his expression unreadable. She, in turn, glanced around the cabin, the rough-hewn shelves, the simple furniture, the rifle mounted on the wall. Everything about the place spoke of a life pared down to its barest bones. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quiet. "I didn't mean to intrude. If the coach hadn't overturned, I wouldn't be here at all." Ethan's eyes flickered toward her, but gave nothing away. Storm doesn't give a damn about plans. "You're here now." Another silence settled, longer this time. She shifted uneasily under his gaze, as if aware that he was still weighing whether her presence was worth the risk. Outside, The storm battered the cabin with unrelenting force, and both of them knew there was no chance of her leaving tonight. Two strangers, trapped together by the will of the weather, one guarded, one desperate, and between them, a fire that warmed more than just a room. The storm did not ease the next morning. Instead, it pressed down harder on the land, a white wall of wind and snow sealing them off from the world. When Ethan opened the door to check the drift against the porch, a blast of freezing air swept through the cabin, rattling the shutters and making Sarah shiver where she sat near the fire. He closed it quickly, muttering something under his breath, and dusted snow from his coat before turning to face her. His expression was hard, his eyes sharp and deliberate. "We're snowed in," he said, his tone gruff, as though announcing a fact he resented. "That means you'll be here a while. So let's set things straight." Sarah straightened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She nodded once, cautious. "All right." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You'll stay inside unless I tell you otherwise. Don't snoop in things that ain't yours. I'll handle the chores outside. You keep to the cabin. When the storm clears, you'll be on your way. Nothing more." The words were firm, but beneath them lingered an unspoken edge. A man long accustomed to solitude, who now found himself unwillingly sharing his space. Sarah recognized it, and instead of bristling, she offered a small, respectful nod. "I understand. I'm only grateful for your kindness. I won't be any trouble." For a moment, Ethan studied her, as though testing the truth of her words. Then he pushed away from the door with a grunt. "Good. That's settled." The cabin fell into silence again, the kind that wasn't entirely comfortable. Sarah watched him move around the space, checking the fire, pulling wood from the stack, setting a kettle on the stove. He was precise in his movements, efficient in a way that spoke of years of routine. She wanted to speak, to ask about the storm, about the land, about him, but she bit back the questions. He had made his rules clear. Still, curiosity itched at her, as persistent as the storm outside. By late afternoon, the scent of stew began to drift through the cabin. Ethan had pulled salted beef from storage, tossed some potatoes and onions, and set the pot to simmer. Sarah offered to help, but he waved her off with a shake of his head. "My kitchen, my way." When he finally ladled the stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table, she thanked him softly. He gave only a curt nod before sitting opposite her. They ate in near silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons and the muffled roar of the storm outside. Sarah, though, could feel the weight of his gaze every so often. He never stared outright, just a quick glance before looking back at his bowl. Yet each time warmth crept up her neck, and she found herself stealing glances of her own. His hands, strong and scarred from work, the hard set of his jaw, the way his eyes, so cold at first, softened when he thought she wasn't looking. It was a quiet dance neither admitted to, a silent conversation spoken through half glances and careful breaths. At one point, Sarah dared to break the silence. "You live here alone?" Ethan spoon paused midair. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in that low, steady voice of his, he said, "Always have, since my folks passed." He took another bite, as though that ended the matter. "I see." She hesitated, then added, "It must be lonely." He looked up at her, eyes meeting hers for the first time without deflection. Something flickered there, something he quickly buried beneath a frown. "It's the life I know," he said shortly. Sarah lowered her gaze to her bowl, but the faint ache in his words lingered with her. She had known loneliness, too, though of a different kind, the kind that came from moving place to place, never truly belonging. Perhaps their solitude wasn't so different, though the walls they built around themselves surely were. After dinner, Ethan gathered the dishes and rinsed them, his movements brisk, while Sarah rose and offered to dry them. For a moment, he looked as if he might refuse. Then, wordlessly, he handed her a clean cloth. They worked in silence, side by side, the space between them charged with an awareness neither could quite shake. When the dishes were done, Sarah retreated to the chair near the fire, pulling her blanket over her lap. Ethan settled across the room, whittling at a small piece of wood with his knife. The crackle of the flames filled the cabin, but underneath it thrummed something else, a tension that wasn't hostile, but wasn't peaceful either. Sarah leaned her head against the chair's back, her eyes drifting to him despite herself. The way the firelight caught the curve of his cheekbone, the concentration in his furrowed brow, the steady strength in his hands. He was not a man of many words, but there was more to him than silence. She could feel it, and when, just once, he glanced up and their eyes met across the firelight, she didn't look away. Neither did he. The storm howled outside, wild and merciless. But inside the cabin, two strangers sat bound not only by circumstance, but by a growing pull neither could ignore. A pull as quiet as a glance, as dangerous as a spark. The storm refused to loosen its grip on the land. For 3 days, snow fell in endless sheets, the wind clawing the cabin walls with a fury that seemed almost personal. The world outside was swallowed whole in white, the road invisible, the barn buried in drifts as tall as a man. There was no question of travel. Sarah was trapped, and Ethan knew it, though he had set his rules firmly at the start. Even he had to admit the silence inside the cabin had begun to shift. On the second morning, Sarah rose earlier than usual, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she found Ethan already pulling on his coat and gloves. "Where are you going?" she asked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Woodpile," he said simply. "Storm won't keep the fire fed." "Let me help." He frowned, pausing at the door. "Not in this weather. You'll freeze." But Sarah only lifted her chin, her eyes alight with quiet stubbornness. "Then I'll stay by the door and stack what you bring in. That's not freezing, it's helping." For the first time since she arrived, Ethan's mouth twitched as though it wanted to form a smile. He shook his head but relented. "Fine. Don't blame me when your hands turn to ice." That morning became the start of a rhythm neither had expected. Ethan hauled the logs in, shaking snow from his coat with every load, while Sarah stacked them neatly by the hearth. By the time they were done, she was laughing softly at the way his hair stuck up from the snow clinging to it, and he, against his better judgment, found himself chuckling under his breath. The cabin grew warmer, not just from the fire, but from the subtle shift between them. The silence that had once been stiff and heavy now carried an undercurrent of ease, threaded with conversation that came more naturally each hour. At mealtimes, Sarah insisted on cooking. Her stew was thinner than Ethan's, but she spiced it with herbs she carried in a small pouch, and the taste startled him. "Never had food like this," he admitted one evening, taking a second bite. She arched a brow at him, teasing. "You mean to tell me you've been eating plain boiled potatoes all your life?" "Salted beef," he corrected, feigning offense. "Don't forget the luxury of salted beef." She laughed, the sound bubbling up light and free, and Ethan was startled by how much he liked hearing it. It filled the cabin in a way the fire never could. During the long hours of storm, they worked together on mending small things around the cabin, patching a tear in a blanket, oiling the hinges of the door, fixing the handle of a drawer. Sarah, nimble with a needle, teased Ethan about his clumsy stitches when he tried to help. "You're better off chopping wood," she said, shaking her head at his crooked attempt. "I'd like to see you handle an axe," he countered, narrowing his eyes playfully. "Maybe I will," she retorted, though they both knew the storm wasn't about to allow such an adventure. It was banter, light-hearted and teasing, yet beneath it ran a current of something else. Something softer, something Ethan hadn't felt in years. He caught himself watching her more often. The way her hair slipped loose when she bent over her sewing, the way she wrinkled her nose when concentrating, the way her smile transformed the dim cabin into something brighter. One evening, as Sarah worked on darning one of his socks by the fire, Ethan sat nearby, polishing his boots. He glanced up, and before he could stop himself, he smiled. It was a small thing, quiet and fleeting, but genuine. The kind of smile he hadn't known his face still remember how to make. Sarah looked up just in time to catch it. She tilted her head, studying him with an amused glint in her eyes. "What?" Ethan quickly cleared his throat, ducking his head back down to his work. "Nothing." Her grin widened, though she wisely said no more. She simply returned to her sewing, though she couldn't stop the warmth from rising in her chest. The storm still raged outside, wild and merciless, but inside the cabin, the air grew easier, lighter. Their days found a rhythm, chopping wood, cooking meals, small repairs, and evenings by the fire. Two strangers, once braced against each other, now found themselves slipping into something that felt startlingly close to companionship. And though Ethan tried to remind himself of the rules he had set, each stolen glance, each shared laugh, each quiet moment made them harder to remember. For the first time in years, he wasn't merely enduring the storm. He was living through it with someone beside him, and realizing, to his quiet surprise, that he didn't want it to end too soon. The storm outside still raged, a constant roar of wind and snow that pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing. Inside, however, the fire burned steady, its glow chasing shadows into the corners. Sarah sat cross-legged near the hearth, sewing needle in hand, though her eyes had long since drifted from her work. Ethan sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, steady strokes, his face unreadable in the flickering light. For hours, the silence had stretched between them, companionable but heavy with the unspoken. Tonight, the storm seemed to demand words. It was Sarah who finally broke it. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if pulling the word from some place she had locked away. "I suppose you wonder why a woman like me was riding a stagecoach through a storm like this." Ethan glanced up, the scrape of the blade against stone pausing mid-motion. His gray eyes studied her, quiet and steady. "Figured it wasn't for pleasure," he said, his tone careful. A faint smile touched her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "No, not pleasure. Necessity." She set her sewing aside, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she seemed to wrestle with herself, then spoke in a rush, as if afraid she might lose her courage. "My family lost everything. My father's debt swallowed up the house, the land, every scrap of what we had. And when it was all gone, the only way left to keep a roof over my head was—" She trailed off, her throat tightening. Ethan leaned forward slightly, though he didn't speak, didn't press. "An engagement," she finished, her voice low. "Arranged, not my choosing." He was older, wealthy, and she hesitated, then forced the truth out. "Unkind. My father thought it was salvation. I thought it was a prison." The fire popped sharply, filling the silence that followed. Sarah lowered her gaze, her hands knotting together tightly. "So I left, took the stagecoach west, hoping to find something better, hoping I might carve out a life that belonged to me, not to someone else's bargain." Ethan set his knife aside, his roughened hands resting on his knees. His face softened, though his voice remained even. That took courage. Sarah gave a small, bitter laugh. "Or foolishness. I can't decide which." Her eyes flicked up to his, searching. "Have you ever done something like that? Walked away from what everyone expected of you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked as though he might close himself off again, as though the old walls might rise. But something in Sarah's gaze, open, vulnerable, honest, seemed to break through. He let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. "I almost married once," he said at last, his voice low, roughened by memory. "Her name was Clara. We grew up together. She was sunshine, laughed at everything, even when she shouldn't. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it warmer just by being there." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to share something so personal. Ethan stared into the fire, his expression far away. "We were set to marry come spring. I'd been building this place for us. Every plank of this cabin, every fence post in the pasture, I put it in with her in mind. But then," his voice faltered. He swallowed hard, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Then fever swept through town. Took her in a week. Nothing I could do, nothing anyone could do." Silence hung heavy, broken only by the howling of the wind and the crackle of flames. Sarah's chest ached at the quiet grief in his voice, the way his shoulders seemed burdened with invisible weight. "I never moved on," Ethan admitted, his tone stark, stripped bare. "Didn't see the point. I stayed out here, working the land, keeping the cattle, fixing fences. Alone, because alone meant I couldn't lose someone again." The confession struck Sarah deep. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her knees. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't meant to show. His gaze met hers then, raw and unguarded. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the fire, two souls laid bare in the flickering light. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was thick, alive, charged with something neither dared name. Sarah's hand twitched, almost reaching across the space to touch his. Ethan's fingers shifted, as though the same impulse stirred within him. For a breathless instant, it seemed inevitable that they would bridge the gap, that skin would meet skin, and the dam would break. But then, almost in the same heartbeat, both pulled back. Sarah tucked her hands into her lap. Ethan clenched his fists against his knees, and the moment unraveled, fragile as smoke. The fire popped again, startling them both slightly. Sarah exhaled, forcing a small smile, though her heart thudded in her chest. "I'm sorry. About Clara." Ethan nodded once, his jaw tight, but his eyes softened with a quiet gratitude. "And I'm sorry about what you've been through. No woman should have to run from her own home just to feel free." For a time, they let the storm speak for them, the howl of the wind weaving around the edges of the cabin. Yet something had shifted between them, something that could not be undone. They were no longer just two strangers forced together by a storm. They were two people carrying ghosts, two people scarred by the past who, despite themselves, had begun to see the faint glimmer of something in each other. Neither would say it aloud, not yet, but both knew it. The firelight had revealed more than old wounds. It had revealed the possibility of healing. The storm finally broke after what felt like an eternity. Snow still blanketed the plains, white and heavy, but the sky above had cleared to a hard, icy blue. Sunlight glittered off the drifts, blinding and sharp. Ethan Cole saddled his horse that morning with the intention of riding into town. Supplies were running thin, and though Sarah insisted she could make do with what they had, Ethan knew better. A rancher didn't gamble with winter. He pulled his coat tight, tugged his hat low against it by the wind, and set off. Sarah had watched him from the cabin door as he mounted. She said little, but Ethan had caught the flicker of worry in her eyes. He gave her a short nod before turning his horse toward town. Somehow, he found himself thinking about her more than the chores he had to do. Sarah Bennett, stranded runaway, strong-willed yet vulnerable, had lodged herself in his thoughts like a thorn he wasn't sure he wanted removed. By the time Ethan reached town, the streets were coated in slush. Horses stamped at hitching posts, breath fogging in the chill. Men moved from storefront to saloon, their boots leaving muddy prints. Ethan dismounted, tying his gelding outside the general store. He kept his head low, as he always did, preferring to move through town unnoticed. Inside, the smell of leather, flour, and tobacco hung thick in the air. Ethan grabbed flour, coffee, salt, and a few tins of beans. Essentials. He set them on the counter, nodding to Mr. Dobbins, the storekeeper. "Storm keep you locked in?" Dobbins asked, tallying the items. 3 days, Ethan replied curtly. Cabin held fine. Dobbins nodded, but before he could speak again, the creak of boots and the heavy slam of the door cut through the store. 3 men entered, snow crusting their coats. Ethan's gaze flicked toward them, cautious. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar along his jaw. The second looked younger, restless, his eyes darting around the store like a hunting dog. The third hung back, older, but with a sharpness in his gaze that unsettled Ethan. "We're looking for someone," the tall one said, his voice carrying through the shop. He slapped a hand against the counter. "A woman, young, brown hair, traveled by stagecoach out this way before the storm hit. Name's Sarah Bennett." Ethan froze, every muscle in his body tightening. He forced himself not to look up, not to react, though his pulse thudded hard against his ribs. Dobbins frowned. "Stagecoach crashed in the blizzard, far as I heard. Don't know that anyone walked away from that." The tall man sneered. "She did. She's out here somewhere. And she belongs to Mr. Alden." Ethan's jaw clenched. He didn't know much about Alden, but the way the man's name rolled off the stranger's tongue made Bow rise in his throat. Belongs. Like Sarah was property, not a person. "You're sure she came this way?" Dobbins asked, wary. The younger man leaned in, eager. Coach Driver swore she ran, said she wanted nothing to do with Alden, but she'll learn. No woman runs from a man like him. Ethan's hand flexed it aside, itching toward the knife at his belt. He kept still, kept quiet. But inside, a storm brewed fiercer than the one that had just passed. The older man finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with menace. We'll check every cabin, every barn if we have to. Word is, there's a rancher out past a ridge. Lives alone. If she's smart, she'd find shelter. And if he's sheltering her, his eyes swept the room, lingering for a beat too long on Ethan's broad shoulders. He'll regret it. Ethan's gaze flicked up then, meeting the older man's stare head-on. For a moment, the air between them crackled. Neither spoke. Then Ethan gave a slow, deliberate shrug, as though uninterested, and returned his focus to the goods on the counter. "Put it on my tab," he muttered to Dobbins, collecting the sack of supplies. As he walked out, he felt the weight of their eyes on his back. His horse stamped impatiently in the cold, and Ethan loaded the supplies, mounting up without a word. Only once he was on the trail home did he let his expression twist, fury simmering in his chest. Sarah's past had caught up with her. The ride back felt longer, his thoughts dark and heavy. He pictured Sarah in the cabin, the way her eyes softened when she smiled, the way her laughter had surprised him by warming the emptiness he thought permanent. The idea of men riding out, dragging her back like stolen property. It twisted something inside him he hadn't felt in years. Protectiveness. Anger. Something sharper, more dangerous. By the time he reached the cabin, dusk had settled and smoke curled from a chimney. Sarah opened the door as he dismounted, her cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. "You're back," she said, relief flickering in her eyes. "Yeah," Ethan replied, carrying the supplies in. He set them on the table, careful not to let the tension in his shoulders show. She helped him unpack, chattering lightly about the bread she'd managed to bake, about how the storm had finally eased enough for her to sweep snow from the porch. Ethan nodded, listening, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of the men, of the threat hanging in the air like the blade of an axe, of the way Sarah's name had been spoken, not as hers, but as a possession. When Sarah looked up at him, curiosity glimmering in her gaze, she tilted her head. "Everything all right in town?" Ethan forced a tight smile. "Quiet as usual. Folks digging out from the storm." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. But it wasn't the truth either. Sarah's shoulders eased, and she returned to unpacking flour and salt. Ethan watched her, a knot forming in his chest. He didn't want to frighten her. Not yet. The storm outside had been enough. The storm coming might be worse, and for now, he would bear the weight of it alone. That night, as Sarah hummed softly while setting the table, Ethan sat in silence, staring into the fire. He had lived alone for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it was like to feel the urge to protect someone. But now he felt it keenly, bone deep. If those men came sniffing around his ranch, they'd learn quick. Ethan Cole had weathered storms harsher than them. And this time, he had something worth standing his ground for. The wind howled low across the plains, carrying with it the brittle bite of winter. Snow had hardened into crusted ridges along the fence line, and the air seemed sharper than usual, like a blade waiting for its sheath. Ethan Cole had felt unease all morning. His instincts, honed over years of working the land alone, told him something was coming. He chopped wood by the barn, the steady swing of the axe grounding him, but every so often his gaze drifted toward the horizon, as if expecting movement where none should be. Inside the cabin, Sarah Bennett hummed softly to herself as she mended a tear in her dress by the fire. Her presence had slowly transformed the place from a silent, lonely shelter into something warmer, something that almost resembled a home. Ethan heard her laughter sometimes, soft, uncertain, but real, and it struck him deeper than he wanted to admit. That was why his gut tightened now. Good things, he knew, rarely lasted unchallenged. By late afternoon, his horse whinnied, ears flicking toward the ridge. Ethan straightened, axe pausing mid-swing. A lone rider approached, cutting across the snowy plain. The figure was wrapped in a heavy coat, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. Something about the man's purposeful ride sent a warning deep into Ethan's chest. He set the axe down, wiping his hands on his coat, and walked toward the fence line. The rider slowed as he neared, drawing up a few yards away. When the stranger lifted his head, Ethan's jaw tightened. The man's eyes were cold, his expression smug, the kind of confidence born not from courage, but from the power of owning too much. "I'm looking for someone," the man said, his voice sharp. "Sarah Bennett." "She's here." Ethan didn't flinch. "You've come a long way in this weather. What makes you think she's here?" The stranger smirked. "Because she's mine. She ran off, but that doesn't change the truth. Her family promised her. She belongs to me." Ethan's fists curled slowly at his sides. That word again, belongs. It rolled off the man's tongue like Sarah was livestock, not flesh and blood. "And if she doesn't want to go back?" Ethan asked, his tone calm but edged with steel. The man's smile faltered for a heartbeat before twisting nastier. "Her choice isn't what matters. She was promised, and I don't take kindly to thieves. Hand her over, or things will get ugly." The cabin door creaked open then, and Sarah's voice carried across the yard. "Ethan." She stepped outside, her face pale against the glow of the firelight behind her. The moment her gaze landed on the rider, her hands froze at her sides. "Sarah," the man said smoothly, tipping his hat as though they were old friends. "You've caused me enough trouble. Time to come home." Her breath hitched audibly, and she shook her head. "No, I'm not going back with you, Robert." Her voice trembled, but there was steel beneath it. "I'd rather face the snow than live under your thumb." Robert's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're saying. You think this man," he gestured at Ethan with disdain, "can protect you? He won't stand a chance when Alden sends more men." Ethan stepped forward then, placing himself squarely between Robert and Sarah. His stance was calm, deliberate, but his presence carried weight. "You're not taking her," he said flatly. "Not tonight. Not ever." Robert's jaw clenched, and his hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip. For a tense moment, silence pressed down, broken only by the wind rattling the bare branches. Ethan's hand hovered near his own gun, steady, ready. "You don't want to test me, boy," Robert spat. Ethan's eyes hardened, the years of solitude and survival etched deep in his stare. "I've buried storms worse than you. Try it, and you won't walk off this land alive." The words hung like a loaded rifle in the air. Robert studied him, measuring the certainty in Ethan's tone. At last, with a sneer, he yanked his reins and wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he barked. "She'll come back one way or another." Snow kicked up as he spurred his horse into the distance, his figure shrinking against the dying light. Only when he was gone did Ethan exhale, shoulders relaxing slightly. He turned, finding Sarah still frozen by the cabin door, her face ashen, eyes wide. She looked shaken to her core, but also something else, relieved. He walked toward her slowly, his voice low. "You all right?" Sarah swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clutched the doorframe. That was Robert, Alden's man. "If he found us, the others will too." Her voice cracked, the weight of fear pressing heavy. Ethan reached out, his hand hovering before finally resting lightly on her shoulder. "He won't touch you," he said firmly. "Not while you're under my roof." Something in his tone, unyielding, protective, seemed to break through her panic. Tears welled in her eyes, but instead of fear, they were born from something deeper. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, she felt safe. That night, Sarah sat close to the fire, her knees tucked beneath her dress, watching the flames dance. Ethan sat across from her, silent, his gaze fixed on the logs burning low. The memory of Robert's sneer lingered, but so too did the memory of Ethan stepping between them, unmovable as the land itself. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" she asked softly, her voice trembling not with fear, but with wonder. Ethan lifted his eyes to hers, the firelight reflecting in the deep blue of his gaze. "Because no one deserves to be treated like possession, and because—" He hesitated, then shook his head, his voice dropping. "Because I couldn't stand to see you taken from here." Silence stretched, heavy and tender. Sarah blinked back fresh tears, her heart thudding. She had been running for so long, chased by duty, fear, and the cruel weight of expectation. But in this cabin, with this man, she felt something she thought impossible: safety. Ethan leaned back, eyes drifting toward the window. The storm clouds gathering once more on the horizon. Trouble would return. He knew it. But for tonight, Sarah was here, and she was his to protect. And if the world wanted to take her back, it would have to go through him first. The storm had settled into a steady hush, blanketing the land in white so thick that the world outside seemed suspended in silence. For days, the cabin had been their whole universe, wood, fire, and the quiet rhythm of surviving together. Ethan moved with practiced ease, chopping kindling, checking the horses, tending to the fire. But lately, his thoughts weren't just on chores. His eyes often strayed toward the corner of the cabin where Sarah sat sewing or reading, her presence filling the space in a way he hadn't realized he needed. One evening, while she was busy inside, Ethan slipped into the barn, carrying a bundle of what he'd chosen carefully. His hands, rough and callous, worked the grain with quiet precision. Each strike of the plane, each notch of the chisel, was deliberate. He told himself it was just a practical task, something useful for her stay. But deep down, he knew it was more. He was building her a chest, a small place where she could keep her few belongings safe, something she could call her own in this uncertain world. As the hours passed, the chest began to take shape. Its edges were uneven, the polish rough, but Ethan's heart was in every line. He remembered how her eyes softened when she spoke of her late mother's keepsakes, lost in her hurried escape. This chest was his answer to that loss, even if he couldn't say it aloud. When he carried it quietly into the cabin that night, Sarah looked up from her mending, surprise lighting her face. "What's this?" she asked, rising slowly as he set it down near the fire. Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "Just something I had wood for. Figured you might need a place for your things." Her hand brushed the smooth lid, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered, though he knew every flaw. "No one's ever made me something like this." She looked up at him then, and for a fleeting moment, gratitude mingled with something deeper. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, nodding as though it were nothing. But inside, his chest tightened with warmth he hadn't felt in years. The next day, Sarah decided she needed to give something back. Supplies were scarce: flour, sugar, dried apples. But she worked with what little they had, her hands careful and determined. The smell of baking filled the cabin, unfamiliar yet comforting, curling through the air like a memory. When Ethan returned from the barn, he paused at the door, catching the scent. "You baked?" he asked, incredulous. Sarah smiled shyly, holding up the small pie, its crust golden though uneven. "It's not much, but you've given me a home, Ethan. I wanted to do something in return." He sat at the table, watching as she set it down with quiet pride. The first bite caught him off guard. The sweetness of apples mingled with the warmth of cinnamon, a taste that reminded him of long-forgotten holidays. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Haven't had a pie in years. You've spoiled me now." Her laugh rang softly, lifting the cabin walls higher than the storm outside ever could. They ate together, sharing stories between bites. Sarah spoke of her childhood summers, chasing fireflies with her brother. Ethan told her about the horse he'd raised from a foal, stubborn as sin but loyal beyond measure. Their voices overlapped in easy rhythm, their laughter breaking through the silences that once clung to him like a second skin. Later that evening, when the chores were done and the pie reduced to crumbs, Ethan reached for something tucked away in a drawer. He pulled out a small harmonica, its edges worn smooth with age. Sarah tilted her head, curiosity shining in her eyes. "You play?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. "Not well," he admitted with a faint smile, "but it passes the time." He lifted it to his lips, blowing a slow, aching tune that filled the cabin with melancholy and warmth. The notes lingered, weaving through the crackle of the fire. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, the melody softening the edges of her restless heart. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes, her voice quiet. "That was beautiful. Play another?" Ethan obliged, this time choosing a lighter tune, something that carried a hint of joy. As he played, Sarah rose, her skirts brushing softly against the wooden floor. She moved closer, drawn by the music and the glow of firelight. When he lowered the harmonica, she extended a hand, hesitating only a moment. "Dance with me," she said, her voice trembling between daring and hope. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "I don't." "You don't have to know how," she interrupted gently. "Just move with me." For a long second, he stood rooted. Then, almost against his own will, he set the harmonica aside and took her hand. Her fingers slipped into his, soft, warm, alive. They began to sway, slow and clumsy at first, but soon falling into a rhythm guided by the flicker of the fire. The room seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them moving in circles, their shadows stretching long against the walls. Sarah laughed softly when his boot nudged hers, and Ethan found himself smiling in return, the rare sound of her joy pulling him closer. Her head tilted, resting briefly near his chest, and he caught the faint scent of lavender and wood smoke. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir in him that wasn't grief. It was hope. When the dance slowed, neither of them stepped away. Their eyes met, the air thick with words unspoken. Sarah's lips parted as though to say something, but she only smiled instead, her cheeks flushed with warmth. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting the urge to close the space between them. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you for everything." Ethan's voice was low, rough. "You've given me more than you know." The fire crackled. The storm rumbled softly beyond the walls. But inside, in that moment, there was nothing but them. Two hearts, scarred by loss and fear, finding their way toward each other. Slowly, quietly, through small gestures that meant everything. The storm returned with a vengeance. By nightfall, the cabin shook beneath the weight of howling winds and heavy snow battering the roof. Ethan had thought the worst of winter had passed, but the blizzard roared fiercer than before, sealing them once again inside the small haven they carved together. He stacked the fire higher, determined to keep the cold at bay, though no fire seemed enough to match the chill outside. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her cheeks flushed from the draft that crept in through the walls. She sat near the fire, her needle and thread idle in her lap. For days now, she had been at the heart of this cabin, cooking, sewing, laughing, and filling silences Ethan had once thought unbreakable. He watched her now, the firelight glinting in her hair, and for the first time, he realized the storm outside didn't frighten him. What frightened him was the thought that one day she might leave. As the wind howled, Ethan busied himself with chores that didn't need doing, pacing the small space. Sarah's eyes followed him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You're restless," she said softly. He froze for a moment, then grunted. "Storm like this makes a man edgy. Reminds him how small he is." She tilted her head, studying him. Or maybe it's not the storm. Her words landed deeper than she knew, and Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. He had been holding it back, telling himself it was just circumstance, just gratitude. But every stolen glance, every laugh shared, every quiet evening by the fire had chipped away at his walls. And tonight, with the world outside buried in snow, there was no more running from it. Finally, he stopped pacing. His hand ran through his hair, rough with nerves he hadn't felt in decades. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, uncertain, "when spring comes, when the road's clear, I don't," he broke off, his throat dry, "I don't want you to leave." The words hung in the air, heavier than the storm. Sarah blinked, surprise flashing in her eyes before a slow, teasing smile curved her lips. "I thought we were just strangers," she murmured, her tone playful, though her voice carried a softness beneath it. Ethan's heart thudded, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "We were," he admitted, "but not anymore, not to me." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the fire's crackle and the storm's roar. Sarah set aside her sewing and rose, her steps light yet deliberate as she crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, tilting her chin to meet his eyes. "You don't make things easy, Ethan Walker," she whispered. His lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "Never claimed I did." The storm rattled the shutters, but neither moved away. Ethan could see the faint rise and fall of her breath, the delicate flush of her cheeks, The way her eyes searched his, as though weighing something unspoken. His hand lifted, hesitated in midair, then finally brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. Sarah's breath caught, and for a moment they simply stood there, hearts pounding in rhythm with the storm outside. Then, as though pulled by an unseen thread, she leaned closer. Ethan met her halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that was tender, hesitant, almost fragile. It wasn't the wild, sweeping passion stories. It was something quieter, deeper, the careful joining of two souls who had carried their loneliness for too long. Her lips were soft against his, her hand rising to rest lightly against his chest. Ethan felt a tremor run through him, the years of silence breaking apart in that single touch. When they finally pulled back, the fire still glowed, but the storm outside seemed distant, powerless against the warmth blooming between them. Sarah's eyes shone as she looked up at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. Not strangers anymore, then. Ethan swallowed, his hand still lingering at her cheek. No, not anymore. They stood there a moment longer, the fire painting their shadows on the cabin walls. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the cold couldn't touch him, not while she was here, not while her kiss lingered like a promise in the storm. The first signs of spring crept into the valley like a secret whispered through the snow. Days that had once been swallowed by white now revealed patches of brown earth, and the icicles dripping from the cabin's eaves fell one by one with soft, musical plinks. For the first time in months, sunlight streamed through the small windows, chasing away the deep shadows that had made the cabin feel like both a refuge and a cage. Sarah stood at the doorway one morning, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, watching the snow recede into glistening streams. Freedom shimmered just beyond the hills, a reminder that soon, very soon, the world would be passable again. Her heart stirred uneasily. This had always been the plan, to wait out the storm and then leave. Yet now the thought of packing her meager belongings and walking away from this place, from him, twisted something sharp inside her. Ethan noticed her quietness. He had grown used to the sound of her laughter in the cabin, the way she hummed while cooking or teased him when his gruffness edged too close to stubborn silence. But these past few days, she seemed thoughtful, distant, her gaze drifting too often toward the horizon. Each time he caught her looking, a cold dread settled deeper in his chest. He knew spring meant release, but the idea of losing her now felt unbearable. He busied himself with work, pouring his unease into his hands. The fence needed mending, tools needed sharpening, and the porch, long neglected, cried out for repair. One morning, Sarah found him sawing planks of wood beneath the warming sun, his sleeves rolled up, his jaw tight with concentration. She tilted her head. That porch has survived this long. Why fix it now? Ethan paused, glancing at her with a small shrug. Storm nearly tore it apart. Figure it's time to build it proper. Maybe add something it's been missing. And what's that? She asked. Instead of answering, he went back to work, his silence saying more than his words ever could. By the end of the day, Sarah watched him hoist up a wooden swing, the chains creaking as he tested its strength. When he finally lowered himself onto it, the board swayed gently, catching the glow of sunset. For a man who spoke little, the gesture seemed impossibly loud. That night, the air between them grew heavy with what neither dared to say. Sarah stirred the stew quietly, while Ethan cleaned his tools by the fire. Every moment stretched, every silence filled with unspoken questions. At last, Sarah broke it, her voice quiet. When the road's clear, I'll have to figure out where to go. Ethan's hand stilled, the rag slipping from his fingers. He didn't look at her right away, afraid she'd see too much in his eyes. Reckon you'll have plenty of choices. Folks out there, family, maybe, waiting for you. She shook her head, staring into the pot. Family's gone. As for choices, I'm not sure where I belong anymore. His chest tightened. He wanted to tell her she belonged here, in this cabin, on this land beside him, but the words stuck, tangled in pride and fear. He had spent a lifetime keeping his heart guarded. Now it pressed against his ribs, demanding release. The next day, when the sun softened the snow further, Ethan made his decision. He polished the wooden swing until it gleamed, then waited until Sarah stepped outside, her skirts brushing against the thawing earth. "Come here," he called gruffly, though his heart thudded like a drum. She walked toward him, brows lifting at the sight of the finished swing. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her hand along the smooth wood. "Built it for you," Ethan said, his voice low but steady, "so you'd have a place to sit, to stay." Her lips parted slightly, surprise flashing across her face. "To stay?" Ethan met her gaze, no longer willing to hide. "I ain't good with words, Sarah. Never have been. But these months you turned this place from an empty cabin into a home. I don't want it to go back to the way it was. I don't want you to go." Sarah's throat tightened, her eyes shining in the afternoon light. She tried to smile, but her voice trembled. "Ethan," he reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple silver band, tarnished but polished until it gleamed faintly. "It was my mother's," he said. "Been sitting in a drawer all these years. Guess I was waiting for the right reason to take it out." Her breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan stepped closer, his rough hand closing gently around hers. "Stay, not as a guest, not as someone passing through. Stay as my wife." For a long moment, Sarah couldn't speak, her heart pounding louder than the melting streams. She looked at him, the man who had opened his door, his table, his guarded heart, and felt every wall she had built around her own heart crumble. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, her voice breaking on the words. "Yes, Ethan, I'll stay." Relief washed through him so strong it nearly buckled his knees. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though the storm might yet steal her away. When she tilted her face up, their lips met again, this time not hesitant, not uncertain, but sure and strong, sealed with the promise of forever. The swing creaked gently behind them, swaying in the thawing wind, a symbol of the home they would now share. And as the last of the winter snow melted into spring, Ethan realized that the storm hadn't taken anything from him. It had given him the one thing he never thought he'd find again: love. The morning of the wedding dawn bright and crisp, the chill of winter still clinging to the edges of the ranch. Frost sparkled across the grass like 1,000 tiny diamonds, yet the sky stretched wide and clear, a soft blue that promised the beginning of spring. Sarah stood by the cabin window, her heart fluttering with a nervous excitement she hadn't known since childhood. She wore a simple white dress, sewn and altered from the fabric Ethan had bartered for in town. It wasn't elaborate, but as she smoothed the skirt with trembling hands, she thought it was more beautiful than any gown money could buy, because it carried the promise of love freely chosen. Ethan, meanwhile, paced outside near the barn, his boots crunching over the thawing ground. He tugged at the collar of his best shirt, one he rarely wore, and adjusted the brim of his hat for the 10th time. The man who had once been content in silence, in solitude, now found himself anxiously awaiting the moment Sarah would step out to meet him. His chest ached with the weight of all he wanted to say, but words had never come easy, so he resolved that when the time came, his vows would be simple, steady, and from the heart. A few townsfolk arrived to witness the union, faces both familiar and kind. Mrs. Hale, the older woman from town who had once helped Ethan with supplies, stood at the front with gentle smile, holding a small Bible. 2 ranch hands who worked alongside Ethan on occasion tipped their hats in quiet respect. It wasn't a grand affair, no church bells, no choir, but Sarah felt the intimacy of it settle warmly inside her. This was not about spectacle. It was about home, about trust, about 2 souls finding each other against all odds. When Sarah finally stepped from the cabin, the wind caught the hem of her dress, lifting it softly around her ankles. Ethan turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment he could only stare. She looked radiant, her dark hair pinned back simply, her eyes brighter than the morning sun. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. You're beautiful," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah's smile trembled as she walked toward him. "And you look like a man I can spend forever with," she whispered back. They stood together before the small gathering, the open sky arching above them, the cabin, their cabin, standing tall behind. Mrs. Hale opened her Bible and began the short ceremony, her voice carrying softly across the clearing. The words were simple, but each one landed heavy with meaning. To love, to cherish, to stand together through storm and sun alike. Sarah's hands trembled as she held Ethan's, her fingers small against his rough palms, yet she felt steadier than ever before. When it came time for vows, Ethan cleared his throat, his usual gruffness giving way to raw honesty. Sarah, I don't have fancy words, but I've lived empty for a long time. You filled this place with laughter, with warmth. You gave me back something I thought was gone forever. I promise I'll protect you, respect you, and never let this cabin or my heart feel empty again. Sarah's eyes blurred with tears as she spoke, her voice soft but strong. Ethan, I came here by accident, and I thought it was only for a season. But you became my safe place, my home. I promise to stand beside you through every storm and every spring with all that I am. Mrs. Hale's smile deepened as she declared them husband and wife. And when Ethan leaned down, kissing Sarah with a tenderness that melted every last trace of winter, the small crowd erupted in quiet claps and cheers. For a man once burdened by silence, the sound of joy filling his ranch felt like the greatest gift. Afterward, they share a modest feast inside the cabin. Stew, bread, and the pie Sarah had saved for this occasion. Laughter filled the small space, neighbors raising their mugs in toasts that left Ethan blushing under the brim of his hat. Sarah, glowing, looked around the room and thought she had never known such contentment. As the day waned and the chill of evening set in, Ethan led Sarah outside once more. The porch swing creaked gently in the breeze. The field stretched wide with promise, and above them, the stars began to shimmer. Ethan pulled out his harmonica, playing a slow, soulful tune that drifted into the night air. Sarah smiled, and before long, he set aside and offered his hand. "Dance with me?" he asked softly. She laughed, shaking her head at the cold, but placed her hand in his anyway. Out here," he replied. And so they danced, slow steps, close together, her head resting against his chest, his arms holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The chill nipped at their cheeks, but the warmth between them made it unnoticeable. For a moment, the world was only the two of them, swaying under the stars, the cabin light glowing softly in the background. In that dance, Sarah felt the weight of every road she'd traveled, every storm she'd endured, all leading her here. And Ethan, who had once believed his heart was buried with the past, realized it had only been waiting for her. As the night settled around them, Sarah lifted her face, whispering, "Home." And Ethan, pressing his forehead to hers, murmured back, "Always." The first days of married life passed not in grandeur, but in the quiet rhythms of ranch living. Yet to Ethan and Sarah, each moment felt extraordinary. Morning sun spilled across the cabin walls, catching Sarah's laughter as she moved about the kitchen, her voice filling the space that had once echoed with silence. Ethan found himself rising earlier than usual, eager not just to tend the cattle or chop the wood, but to catch that first glimpse of her smile as she stirred the fire to life. It wasn't the chores that had changed, but the meaning woven into them. Every step, every sound, carried the weight of belonging. Sarah quickly found herself folded into the fabric of Ethan's world. She learned to mend tack with careful stitches, her fingers growing deft as he taught her the ways of the ranch. She took pride in baking bread with the flour he hauled in from town, and together they planted a small garden just outside the cabin. There was joy in their teamwork, a natural rhythm that grew day by day. Where once Ethan had worked in silence, now there was laughter, light-hearted teasing, and the comfort of two voices weaving through the day like music. Evenings became their favorite hours. After supper, Ethan would sit on the porch swing he built. Sarah nestled close against him, wrapped in a quilt she'd stitched from old scraps. Sometimes he played the harmonica, low and sweet, while she hummed along. Other nights, they simply sat in silence, watching the stars scatter across the vast sky. To Ethan, those evenings were proof that love didn't need words or grandeur. It was found in the steady pulse of shared life, in the warmth of a hand held close. The ranch itself began to look different, though little had truly changed. Where once Ethan had seen loneliness in its wide fields and silent barns, now he saw promise. Sarah's touch had softened the hard edges, her presence weaving beauty into the rough-hewn cabin, turning it from mere shelter into home. A flower box beneath the window, a pie cooling on the sill, a patchwork quilt draped over the chair. Small, Simple touches that made the space glow with life. Ethan often caught himself standing in the doorway, just watching her move about, humbled that she had chosen to stay. As weeks turned to months, the storm of the past seemed to fade like snow melting beneath the spring sun. Sarah's fears of being dragged back to the life she fled grew quieter with each passing day, replaced with a steady sense of safety she had never known before. Ethan, too, found his old ghosts loosening their grip. The memory of the fiancée he had lost no longer weighed him down. Instead, it felt as though she had left a blessing, guiding Sarah to his door that fateful stormy night. One afternoon, as the skies stretched wide and golden, Ethan saddled the horses. He called to Sarah, who appeared in the doorway, brushing flour from her apron with a laugh. "Come on," he said, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I've got something to show you." She climbed up onto her mare, adjusting her skirts, and together they set out across the ranch. The land rolled out endlessly before them, fields shimmering under the sun, mountains dark and steady on the horizon. They rode side by side, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a steady drumbeat. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against hers until she caught it, their fingers lacing together even as the reins hung loose. For a long while, they said nothing, letting the silence of the wide prairie wrap around them like a blessing. The wind tugged at Sarah's hair, the scent of earth and pine filling the air, and she realized this was freedom, not escape, but belonging. At last, Ethan slowed his horse, drawing her attention to the cabin below, small but strong against the backdrop of endless land. "There," he said softly, his voice low with emotion. "That's ours. Not just a place to live, but a forever home." Sarah's throat tightened, her eyes misting as she followed his gaze. She knew what he meant, that the cabin, the ranch, this land, wasn't just a shelter against storms. It was the place they would build their life together, brick by brick, season by season. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and pink. Sarah leaned into Ethan, her head resting lightly against his shoulder as their horses carried them back toward the glow of their cabin. She thought of the girl she'd been when the storm first forced her into his barn, lost, frightened, running from a life not her own. And she thought of the woman she was now, riding hand in hand with the man who had become her heart's anchor. That night, back at the cabin, Ethan stoked the fire as Sarah lit the lanterns. The warmth spilled across the wooden walls, casting the room in golden light. She set supper on the table, and he reached out, catching her hand before she could turn away. He kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "We've weathered storms," he murmured, his eyes steady on hers, "and we'll weather 1,000 more. As long as you're here, I've got all I'll ever need." Sarah smiled, tears brimming but unshed, and leaned into his embrace. "And I," she whispered, "finally know what it means to be home." Outside, the prairie stretched vast and endless, but within the cabin, love had carved out a space of warmth and belonging. The man who had once been a lonely cowboy and the woman who had once been a runaway bride now stood side by side, their hearts bound not by chance, but by choice. And so, with laughter echoing in the cabin, the stars blazing overhead, and the promise of tomorrow waiting on the horizon, Ethan and Sarah began their forever, not just in a house, not just in a marriage, but in a true home.